I still remember the bite of that wind. November in the subarctic has a way of sinking into your bones like needles of ice. And that year, it felt worse. The trees were bare skeletons, creaking as I trudged through the deep snow, snowshoes crunching softly in the brittle silence. My name's Joe LaBelle. I've been trapping furs in this part of northern Canada for more winters than I care to count. But I wasn't out here for game. Not this time. I was headed for the Inuit village near Anjikuni Lake, a small fishing camp where I'd often stopped for warmth, stories, and a bite to eat. Good people. Quiet folk, but kind. Always left a pot of stew simmering and a place near the fire for a weary traveler. That village had always been a beacon of warmth in this desolate stretch of wilderness, until the day it wasn't. I'd been walking for nearly 6 hours when I crested the last hill and saw the lake beyond the trees, its frozen surface shimmering beneath the gray sky. The village sat at its edge, just as it always had. Dozens of huts built from timber and stone, clustered like children huddled together for warmth. But even from a distance, something felt off. I stopped, listened. No dogs barking, no laughter. Not even the rhythmic chop of firewood or the soft crackle of smoke curling upward. Just wind. Just silence. I tightened my grip on my rifle and continued down the slope. When I reached the village, the first thing I noticed was that the fires were still burning. Barely. Embers smoldered in pits. Smoke curled weakly from a few chimneys. I called out, "Kalik? Nuda? It's Joe." No answer. My voice bounced off the ice and vanished into the pines. I walked to the nearest hut, my boots crunching against the frost, and pushed open the door. Inside, everything was in place. Blankets neatly folded, a half-knitted parka lying in someone's lap, needles still threaded through the seal skin. A cup sat on the table, its contents frozen over. I stepped back outside, heart beginning to beat harder. Something was wrong. No tracks in the snow, no signs of movement. Just abandonment. As if the whole village had vanished mid-thought. I moved to the next hut, then another. Same story. A bowl of frozen stew. A child's toy left in the snow. A pair of muklux set neatly by the door. I called louder, desperate now, naming every face I remembered. Anana. Tikani. Elder Siku. Still nothing. The air was thick with absence. That's the only way I can explain it. Not death, not violence, just absence. The kind that eats at your sanity. When I reached the center of the camp, I paused outside the communal tent, the heart of the village where elders told stories and families shared food. I hesitated before entering. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled aside the flap. Inside, the fire pit was blackened. A pot still hung over it, crusted with a long burnt stew that had boiled away to nothing. Bowls were set out in a circle, spoons resting inside them. Blankets and sleeping mats lay scattered as if people had just stepped out for a moment. But no one had come back. I let my pack slide from my shoulder and hit the frozen ground with a thud. That sound echoed in the emptiness. And that's when it truly hit me. They were gone. All of them. Not a soul left. Not a single one. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The cold pressed against the canvas of the communal tent like a living thing, and even wrapped in my furs, I felt its reach settle deep into my chest. But it wasn't just the cold. It was the stillness. The kind of silence that doesn't belong in a village full of life. I kept waiting to hear footsteps crunching in the snow outside. A soft knock, a voice calling my name. But there was nothing. Just the occasional groan of wind rattling the flaps in my own breath, short and shallow. By the time the gray light of morning bled into the sky, I'd already made up my mind. I had to search. I had to understand. I started with the nearest huts, one by one. My boots left the only new prints in the crusted snow. The wind hadn't yet buried the older ones, but there were so few. Only the faintest traces, almost as if the villagers had stopped walking all at once. Inside the first home, I found a kettle frozen to the stove, a spoon still resting beside it. There were furs on the floor, a sleeping mat half unrolled. In another hut, A book lay open on a carved bench, a pair of reading glasses beside it. I turned the pages with a shaking hand. The ink had bled from the moisture in the air, but the story was still there. Someone had been reading it, probably the night before I arrived. Each hut was worse than the last. In one, a baby's cradle with a fur blanket neatly folded. No signs of panic, no signs of violence, just absence. The last meal half-cooked, garments half-stitched, hunting spears still leaned against the walls. In one home, I found a needle left mid-thread through a seal-hide coat, the sinew still dangling like a question mark. It was as if they had stood up mid-task and walked away, but where and why? I called out names I remembered from seasons past. Nuda, Kalik, Tikani. My voice rang out, desperate, and faded into the woods. No one answered, not even an echo. My breath clouded the air, but it was the only sign of life. I stepped into the largest family hut, the one with the carved totem above the door. A hearth sat cold and gray. A bowl of dried berries had spilled onto the floor. I bent to pick one up and felt my throat tighten. My fingers trembled. Something was terribly wrong. At first, I wondered if it was sickness, some fast-acting plague that had claimed them all and left no bodies. But where were the signs? There was no blood, no chaos, no overturned furniture, no scrawled messages or claw marks or barricaded doors. The more I looked, the more it seemed they hadn't fled, hadn't died, but had simply ceased to be here. Then my mind turned darker. Had someone come for them? Raiders? I'd heard stories of rival tribes, but these people had no enemies. And again, there were no signs of struggle, no broken locks, no dropped weapons. I found bows and quivers untouched, fishing gear lined up in perfect rows. If something came, they hadn't fought it. The sun never rose fully that day. It hovered low and pale, like a dying eye on the horizon. By late afternoon, the shadows stretched long and sharp, and I realized I hadn't seen a single track heading outward. The snow around the village was undisturbed, untouched by feet, by sleds, by anything alive. It was as if the forest had closed around this place like a fist. I returned to the communal tent as darkness fell, lighting a small lantern and setting it in the center. I didn't want to sleep, but I couldn't leave yet. I needed answers. I kept staring into the flickering light, the shadows dancing across the canvas walls. Every now and then, I thought I heard something just beyond them. A creak, a whisper. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself. Maybe it was the cold getting to me. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt it. An invisible pressure, like being watched from a place just out of sight. My hands wrapped tight around the rifle laid across my lap. I kept the lantern burning and my back to the fire pit all night. Because whatever had taken the people of Anjikuni Lake, I was starting to believe it hadn't left. At first light, I forced myself out of the communal tent, the lantern long since burned out, the cold biting worse than ever. I hadn't truly slept, just drifted in and out of some half-aware state, every creak of canvas or gust of wind jolting me back to alertness. My rifle felt heavier that morning, my breath fogging the air in thick clouds as I trudged through snow already beginning to drift higher around the huts. I wasn't sure what I was looking for anymore. Clues, maybe. A sign. A reason. Something to explain how 30 people could simply vanish. I headed toward the edge of the camp, toward the grove where I remembered the burial ground stood. Stone-marked graves nestled under the trees. The Inuit didn't talk much about the dead, but they honored them, kept them close, safe. It didn't take long to find the site. The low stones poked through the snow like jagged teeth, and I knelt beside the nearest one, brushing away the frost. The markings were still visible, simple carvings, nothing elaborate, but filled with reverence. There were maybe a dozen graves, all encircled by low rings of stones, meant to keep scavengers away. And then I saw it. One of the graves had been opened. Not dug up in any panicked frenzy, no. The stones that had encircled it were still in place, undisturbed, as though someone had carefully lifted the covering snow and dirt, removed what lay beneath, and then gently placed the stones right back where they were. I stood frozen, not from the cold this time, The grave itself gaped like an open mouth. The earth beneath had been hollowed out, clean and deliberate. No claw marks, no scattered bones, no mess. Just a void where someone had once rested and now didn't. I stepped closer, crouched down, and inspected the disturbed grave. The snow hadn't been blown in. There were no animal tracks, no prints at all. The hole had hard-packed sides, almost smooth. Not what a bear or wolf would leave behind. This had been done by hands, human or otherwise. But why? And more importantly, who? I reached into my pack and pulled out the journal I kept for long winters. My fingers were numb, barely able to hold the pencil, but I needed to document it. I began to write a message, something I could leave behind if I didn't make it to the telegraph station. My handwriting came out jagged and uncertain. November 16th. Found grave disturbed. Body removed. Not animals. Looks like it was opened. Intentionally. Village still empty. No sign of life. No tracks. I don't know what to think anymore. I paused. Something rustled behind me. I whipped around so fast I nearly dropped the journal. My breath hitched, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just the wind sighing through the pines. And yet, I swear I'd heard it. A whisper of movement, like someone shifting in place, watching. I held my rifle close, knuckles white, and waited. A full minute passed, maybe more. Nothing came, but the feeling stayed. I stood slowly, backing away from the grave, eyes flicking to every shadow and branch. That's when I remembered the old stories, half-whispered warnings from elders, tales shared around the fire late at night. Legends of beings that walked in the snow without leaving tracks. Spirits that moved like fog and fed on silence. I'd always thought they were metaphors, stories to keep children close to home. Now I wasn't so sure. I left the grave behind and made my way back to the camp, trying not to turn my back on the trees, trying not to listen too hard for footsteps that shouldn't be there. My journal pressed against my chest, its pages fluttering slightly in the wind. And as I crossed into the camp once more, a thought struck me so suddenly, it made me stop in my tracks. What if the grave wasn't opened after they vanished? What if that's where it started? I waited for the sun to rise higher that morning, though in this part of the world it barely lifts itself above the trees during November. When the gray light finally deepened enough to move with some sense of direction, I decided to search the outskirts of the camp. I needed to find the sleds, or any trace of movement that might make sense of what had happened. The villagers didn't go anywhere without their dogs, not for hunting, not for traveling. I figured if I could find the sled teams, maybe I could find tracks leading away from here. Anything to explain the void this place had become. I found them near the tree line, in a small clearing where the villagers used to keep the dogs tethered when they weren't working. 7 of them, all tied in a neat line, all dead. The sight stopped me cold. They were still in their harnesses, roped to their posts, stretched out in the snow like scattered branches. Their bodies were twisted with hunger and desperation, their ribs jutting from their fur like knives. Their eyes, what was left of them, were open. Some had snapped their teeth down on their own legs. Others lay stiff with their heads against the frozen earth, as if listening for something that never came. They hadn't been fed in days. No one had come for them. No one had even tried. I dropped to my knees and stared at them for a long time. The cold didn't matter anymore. My heart felt heavier than the rifle on my back. I knew these dogs, strong, loyal animals. These people would have never left them like this. Not even in fear. Not even in death. Inuit treated their dogs like lifelines, like family. And yet here they were, abandoned and forgotten. I reached out and touched the fur of the lead dog. It crumbled beneath my fingers, brittle with frost and starvation. I didn't realize I was crying until my breath caught in my throat, the tears freezing before they even hit the snow. That's when the memory hit me. A few winters ago, one of the village elders, Siku, sat with me by a fire, chewing on dried fish and humming to himself. He was old, his face like a weathered map, his voice thick and low. He'd told me a story about the shadows in the snow. Spirits, he said. Cold ones. Not ghosts, not demons, but something older. Things that came before names. He warned me never to follow singing voices in the wind, never to approach a trail that ended in nothing, and never, never to ignore an opened grave. At the time, I'd laughed it off. Just fire talk, I'd thought. Just the kind of stories men tell when the dark gets too long. Now I wasn't so sure. I took my knife from my belt and began to dig. The ground was hard and frozen, but I didn't care. I couldn't leave them like this. Not the dogs. They didn't deserve to be forgotten in the snow. I worked until my fingers went numb and my knuckles cracked. One by one, I pulled their stiff bodies free from the chains and buried them in a single mound, covering them with branches and stones. I marked the grave with my own trapper's blade, sticking it into the earth as a sign someone had cared enough to remember. The wind picked up as I stood, and I looked back toward the camp. The snow was falling again, soft at first, then heavier, blowing sideways in thin white sheets. A storm was gathering, rolling in fast from the west. I had to move, and soon. If I didn't make it to the telegraph station before it hit, I might end up frozen right alongside them. I took one last look at the dogs and whispered an apology. Then I turned toward the path I knew would lead me south. As I walked, I kept my eyes on the trees, but something else kept my ears straining. A low sound, almost buried beneath the wind. It wasn't the cry of wolves. It was humming, high and distant, and it was getting closer. I didn't look back. After burying the dogs, after hearing that eerie, rising hum in the wind, I packed what little I had and began my journey south, toward the telegraph station. There was no more time to search. No more room for wondering. Whatever had happened in Anjikuni had already happened. My only duty now was to tell someone. Anyone. Before whatever had taken them turned its gaze on me. The snowstorm hit not long after I passed the last birch tree beyond the village. It came fast, sudden, like it had been waiting. The wind howled through the branches and turned every breath to knives. I wrapped my scarf tight, bent forward, and pushed on, each step a struggle. The trail I usually followed had already begun to vanish under fresh powder. I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead, but I knew this land. I'd walked it 100 times. I thought I could make it. I had to. But the feeling followed me. That crushing weight I'd felt in the camp. That sense that I was being watched. It didn't lift with distance. If anything, it got worse. I began glancing over my shoulder more than forward. I thought I saw movement behind the trees, a shadow where there should have been none, shapes that didn't match the sway of wind or snow. I told myself it was exhaustion, paranoia, but it didn't feel imagined. It felt aware. I stumbled upon a hunting shack just before dusk, barely visible through the blowing white curtain of snow. I'd used it before. A small wooden hut set up by other trappers, a kind of shared safe house for storms. I nearly collapsed inside, the door creaking shut behind me as I fell to my knees. My legs ached, my fingers tingled with the early stages of frostbite, and my lips were cracked from wind. But then I saw it, on the far wall, symbols, carved into the wood. Dozens of them, circles, lines, spirals, not letters, not words. Symbols like the ones I'd seen once, years ago, on the shaman's tent in the village. Symbols meant to protect, or to warn, or both. I ran my hand over the carvings, heart pounding. The lines were fresh, the wood still rough from the cuts. Someone had etched them recently, maybe days ago, maybe hours. My mind reeled. Had someone tried to leave a message here? Had someone survived? Or had something else left them? Something trying to keep others from following? I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire low and my rifle close, watching the door, flinching at every creak and whistle of wind through the cracks. At one point, I swear I heard voices outside. muffled, soft, almost melodic, like singing. But when I opened the door, there was only snow. No tracks, no sound. When morning came, the storm had calmed just enough for me to travel. I didn't hesitate. I walked, stumbled, crawled when I had to. Every part of me burned with cold, but I kept going. The images of the village, those lifeless huts, the empty grave, the starving dogs, pushed me forward. I had to get word out. I had to reach someone before the memory of that place became just another whisper in the cold. I arrived at the telegraph station half dead. I remember the look on the operator's face. Shock, fear, maybe a little disbelief. I didn't speak much, just scrawled the message with shaking hands, forcing every letter out like it was a scream. Urgent stop Anjinikuni village, abandoned, stop no survivors, stop no tracks, stop grave disturbed, stop dogs dead, stop send RCMP immediately, stop. I collapsed after that. My body gave out as soon as the message was sent. And in that sleep, if it was sleep at all, I saw them, the villagers. But they weren't right. They moved slowly, backward, as if time itself had come undone. Their faces were blank, their eyes clouded with snow, and all of them walked into the fog, disappearing one by one, without a sound, without a trace, just like before. They arrived 2 days after I collapsed at the telegraph station. The RCMP, 3 men dressed in heavy wool coats and thick boots, faces hard as ice, eyes sharp with skepticism. I was barely standing, still half frostbitten and fevered, but I insisted they follow me. I don't remember much of the journey back, just flashes, my legs giving out more than once, the younger Mountie muttering about ghost stories, the wind screaming through the trees as if trying to drown us out. I led them through the path I knew by memory, back to that godforsaken village, and all the while something in my gut twisted tighter and tighter. By the time we reached Anjikuni, the sun was low, and snow coated everything in a fresh, pristine layer. But the village was just as I'd left it, eerily still, deathly quiet. The 3 officers spread out, rifles slung over their backs, expressions unreadable. They checked the huts, just like I had. They saw the stew pots, the half-finished garments, the empty homes with no signs of struggle or blood. They stood over the opened grave, their faces pale beneath their scarves, and said nothing. And then they found the dogs, buried under snow now, but still unmistakable. The youngest officer looked like he might be sick. I watched them trying to make sense of it all, just like I had. I waited for them to offer some reasonable explanation, but none came. And that's when things started to shift. It began with little details, subtle, but unmistakable. One of the huts we'd already checked appeared slightly different. A chair had moved. A set of footprints I'd left in the snow the week before had vanished, covered too neatly, like they'd been brushed away by something that didn't want us following the wrong path. The lead officer, a man named Brecker, asked me if I was sure I hadn't come back alone during the storm. I told him no. I hadn't returned until now, and I wasn't the one rearranging things. We gathered in the communal tent that night, the 4 of us huddled around a lantern that barely kept the shadows at bay. The wind outside had died down, but the silence it left behind was worse. I could feel it pressing in, like the whole forest was listening. I didn't sleep. None of us really did. And sometime in the deepest part of the night, the youngest Mountie, Constable Fielding, bolted upright and whispered, "Did you see that?" We all froze. He pointed toward the edge of the tent flap, hands shaking. There was someone there, I swear. Something moved. Brecker dismissed it. Just shadows, tricks of the light. But I saw it in Fielding's face. He hadn't imagined it. His skin was clammy. His eyes darted from corner to corner, tracking movement none of us could see, or didn't want to. The next morning, we continued our investigation, if you could even call it that. At that point, we weren't collecting evidence. We were grasping for sanity. Brecker entered one of the smaller huts while I stood watch nearby. Moments later, he called out, voice trembling. Inside, sitting on a small wooden table, was something that hadn't been there before. A set of human teeth. fresh, still bloody at the root. No explanation, no animal remains, no sign of who they'd come from, just teeth, arranged in a neat little circle like an offering. We didn't speak of it, not then. Brecker just wrapped them in cloth and shoved them in his coat, muttering something about forensics. But that night, back in the communal tent, no one slept. The air was thicker, heavier. The shadows moved more freely. I could hear them now, faint footsteps crunching snow just beyond the edge of the tent. Low, rhythmic breathing that didn't belong to any of us. Fielding sat in the corner, rocking slightly, whispering to himself. The other Mountie, Corbin, clutched his rifle all night, barrel pointed toward the door. Just before dawn, I stepped outside for a breath of air and felt it. The woods had grown too quiet. Not dead quiet, expectant quiet. As if something was waiting for us to decide, to leave or to stay. And deep within the trees, just barely visible through the frost-covered pines, I saw it. A figure, tall, unmoving, watching. And when I blinked, it was gone. The next morning was our last. At least it should have been. The RCMP had seen enough. I could see it in Brecker's face. Something had cracked beneath his calm. We were done pretending we were dealing with something explainable. There were no signs of disease, no evidence of violence, no tracks leading out of the camp, no hint of where the villagers had gone. Just the silence. And the teeth. And the thing I'd seen watching us from the trees. We were supposed to pack and leave at first light, to report back and let someone else figure out what had happened here. But fate, or whatever shadow ruled over this place, had other plans. Corbin was the first to notice it. He'd gone to inspect the shaman's hut before departure, more out of curiosity than duty. It was smaller than the others, older, adorned with faded symbols painted in soot. But something was missing. A few somethings. An ancient mask carved from bone. Gone. The ceremonial staff with the twisted top that I remembered seeing every winter, always placed near the fire, vanished. There were fresh drag marks in the dust on the floor, as if the objects had been taken recently. No footprints, no handprints, just absence, as if they had slipped out of the world like smoke. Brecker didn't say much. He just took a long breath and muttered, "Get your gear. We're leaving." But not all of us made it. Fielding had gone ahead to check the sleds. We'd heard his voice echo once across the village, a soft, "Hey," that cut through the still air like a bullet. Then, silence. I was the first to reach where he'd been. The snow around the sled was undisturbed. No broken trees, no dropped pack, no sign of a struggle. And no Fielding. Just his footprints, leading in from the main hut. They stopped 10 feet from the sled, mid-stride. One boot print, then nothing. Not a smear, not a trail. Just clean, perfect snow stretching out in all directions. We called for him for nearly an hour, our voices cracking from the cold and the panic setting into our bones. Brecker finally shouted at me, told me we were done. We were leaving now before we all vanished one by one. I didn't argue. I just looked down at Fielding's last step, frozen there in the snow like a question carved in white. And I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been watching us from somewhere just beyond the trees. Not hiding, waiting. As we loaded up and turned our backs to the camp for the last time, I remembered something the elder Siku had once told me on a night long ago, when the auroras danced above Anjakuni like ghosts on fire. He spoke of the skywalkers, not gods, not spirits, but ancient things that moved between the stars and shadows. Things that didn't kill. They collected. Tribes. Memories. Entire places, swallowed up into silence, taken without sound, without struggle. They walk where the snow remembers nothing, he had said. No tracks. No cries. Just cold. At the time, I had thought it was just folklore. Now I wonder if we'd walked through a place that had been chosen. The RCMP closed their reports. The story made the rounds, embellished in newspapers, dismissed in official documents. The village was marked as abandoned under unknown circumstances. but I know what I saw. I know what followed us. Sometimes, late at night, I wake and hear the wind outside my cabin door. And beneath it, faint and terrible, I swear I hear humming, like a lullaby sung by mouths that no longer exist. I never return to Anjikuni, because not everything lost is meant to be found, and some places don't vanish. They wait.